Welcome to this presentation I call Daniel's Messiah. Why? Because we're going to try to see how it would be possible for Daniel to see and understand the prophecies he got. Well, my name is Toby Juritek, as you probably know, since you find me on my homepage or on YouTube. I'm a medical doctor and have a PhD in medical science. So I'm not a theologian, no training there whatsoever. But my heart has been burning for decades to understand Daniel 10 to 12. And they are part of the main focus in these presentations. So at one point, I gave up and cried out to the Lord, help me to understand. And he gave me this insight I'm going to present to you right now. In short summary, he is the fulfillment, not us. We Christians can be a part of God's kingdom and activities. Yes, he wants that even, but he still remains the focus. So I praise God for all this. Daniel, for him, the time chronology is not of importance. If so, he would have written quite differently. For example, if you follow the time chronology, it would be chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and then jump to 7 and 8, and then go back to 5 and 6, and eventually do the last one, 9 to 12. So that was not important to him. What was important to him was the languages in which it's written. The first chapter is written in Hebrews, in the Hebrew language, and is about the Hebrews. And the same thing in chapters 8 to 12. I'm going to show you that is also written for and about the Hebrews, the Old Covenant people of God. The Aramaic part, which starts in verse 4 in chapter 2 and goes all the way to including chapter 7, is about the world order, the four world powers described in both in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. And I'll leave that for now. So the main thing is, as I said, the language part and the Hebrew people. And one thing to confirm that even more is the world powers in Daniel 2 to 7 are using unclean animals according to Leviticus 11. And chapters 8 to 12 are using clean animals according to Leviticus 11 to follow and point to the Hebrew people, Daniel's people. So Daniel's people has to focus, and that's why they also have the introduction in chapter 1. Another thing that I found to be very interesting is that in Hebrew writing, they often have the summary first. For example, in Genesis 1:1, God created heaven and earth, and that could have been enough. And then start the story with Adam and Eve. No, then he added 2 more chapters, a detailed description about the creation story. And the same thing is found, for example, in Daniel 10, verse 1. Daniel had a vision. He didn't understand it, but he had 2 words to summarize it. It's about the truth and about the great war. And we have also the same in Jesus, when they write about Jesus Christ in the New Testament. You can go to Luke 18 and verse 1. And there it says the summary, we should always pray and don't lose heart. And then comes the story about that in verses 2 to 8. And in the verse 9, again, a summary, and that This parable is about those who thought they were righteous and despised others. And then in verse 10 to 14, that story follows to explain what Jesus meant. And Paul did the same thing. Romans 14, verse 1. That chapter is about disputable matters. That means smaller matters, not big essential things. So what also came out of this is that the time chronology needs to be taken literally. And if so is done, it all points to Jesus and his first coming. And that's why I call it Daniel's Messiah. So let's now start with Daniel chapter 8. And we're going to have a few presentations on that. But the first one we're going to look at now, and I'll go over to the PowerPoint presentation. Another thing I've done is, according to what God advised me to do, is to put Daniel 8. I used the NIV version and put it side by side, the vision and the explanation. And with that concept, it became so much clearer what belongs to what. Let me show you here, and we go over to the first slide. And there we can see that in verse 1 and 2, I'm going to check that very soon, there is nothing that matches what's coming here in the explanation part. The vision is written down in verses 1 to 14 and the explanation from 15 to 27. And just look at it. When I go forward a little bit here, you can see what's going on here. So with that way of doing it, it became so much clearer. Let me show. Here in verse 1, we have a background. We're looking for actually background summary. And we have it in part here in verse 1, because we know the timing. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, and Daniel had a vision. That's good. Then we know the timing. And then in verse 2, it talks about it was in the city of Susa and in the province of Elam, and it was by the Ulai River. So there we have the place. But we don't have the information about how to understand it, to understand the message in Daniel 8. So then we have to go to the explanation side and start with verse 15. And there we can read, while I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it. He's a good man, Daniel. He truly wants to study and understand as much as possible. And often he asks questions, so we get to know more things about it. When he's trying to understand, before him stood one who looked like a man. We're not told here in this chapter who this man is. I think it's the same man as comes in Daniel chapter 10, the man dressed in linen. We're going to come back to him. And because it says he looked like a man. He is not a man, but looked like one. And then he hear a man's voice. I believe that is the one who looks like a man, from the Ulai calling, Gabriel. So here comes the command. So someone with higher authority than Gabriel is given the command. Tell this man, Daniel, the meaning of the vision. That's good. So here we know was the introduction. Let's go on and see what happens. Verse 17. As he came near the place where that means Daniel, was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. So he was so scared, so he fell into worship position. And Gabriel started to talk to him, Son of man, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. And of course, when we and he heard it, we all think, well, this is the time we live in now. This presentation is recorded in May of 2022. We must live in the time of end. We have a pandemic that's maybe is over, maybe not. And then we have a war going on in Europe and so on. Yeah, so time of the end. But we need to be very careful because in Daniel alone, we have 3 ends clearly described. For example, go to the last verse in Daniel 12, and there we have Daniel's end of his days, which is when he dies. And we have the end of the days. That means the end of this world when Jesus comes back. But there is the third one too, we're going to come back to later. So it's a time of, let's say right now, an end. So after that, when he was speaking to me, that was too much, said Daniel. And he fell in a deep sleep. He fainted. Poor guy. And with his face to the ground. Yeah, he had that position before, but now he's out. And then he needs help. And Gabriel touched him and raised him on his feet. So now again, Gabriel is ready to present the message from the man dressed in linen. In verse 19, he said, I'm going to tell you what will happen. And now comes the summary. As you can see, now I have about 10 plus words left of the 2 lines there in English. But if you look below, I've summarized the 5 words which exist in the Hebrew language. And I've been written also down the Strong's number below, so we know what they are. It means what I know what they are, so I can look them up and so on. And these 4 words are end, wrath, for, appointed time. There's only one Hebrew word, and end again. And of course, this is tough for the translators. They need to make a sentence out of this, and that's not so easy. I can understand they have had a hard time here. Let's go over those slowly and see what the 5 words means to us right now. Here we see what will happen later. Some do that, but the majority of the Bible versions write end. So in the end, and then in the time of wrath, because the visions concerns the appointed time of the end. Wow. But don't lose heart. Just follow slowly here. We're going to see what defining things we can find. The first word, end, is a significant end. Not like the end of the day or end of the meal or end of a discussion and so on, no. And the dictionary, I have several of them. One of them said, it's like the end of a person's life. Oh, I love that. So for me, that was the first one, looking at it could be Christ's death on the cross. The second one, the wrath. Some write also indignation, but it really means wrath. So there need to be a time of wrath. And of course, you need to fit timely to the Bible in all other ways. So let's go to Romans 5, verse 9, where he talked about what Jesus has accomplished. Much more than, having now been justified by his blood, that we have been justified by Jesus' blood, we shall be saved from the wrath through him, through Jesus. So we are saved from God's wrath. And why? Because Jesus took upon himself the wrath we, his believers, deserve. So yes, it's a well-known fact that when Jesus died on the cross, he took the wrath upon himself. So first 2 here can easily be seen, Jesus dying on the cross. The word for is a preposition. It just means here that the first 2 words, end and wrath, are together with appointed time and the word end again. So let's go now to the third defining statement when it comes to how to understand, to interpret this Daniel 8 prophecy. Appointed time. As you see, that's only one word. And interestingly enough, that is not always how it's translated to appointed time. Let me go to Isaiah 33 and 20 and see what it says there, for example. Look upon Zion, that's Jerusalem, the city of our appointed feasts. And later it talks about Jerusalem, the city of our appointed feasts. That's the same word. And most of the time, that word, here with Strong's number 4150, refers to the biblical feast days. So let's go to Leviticus 23, verse 4. These are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. In this verse alone, we 2 times find this Hebrew word we have also here in Daniel 8, verse 19. So it refers to a biblical feast. And then, of course, we have the Passover. Jesus died during the Passover. And the 4th word is an end. And that, as I said before, is a little more tricky. But we can go to, for example, Daniel 9:26, and we have the same word for end. As you see, by the way, before we go on, the last word has strong number 7093, but the first one has 319. So it's totally different words, but has the same English word. So let's go to 9:26. There it talks about the end of a war. And I'll talk to that already on presentations about the book of Revelation, the war described in chapter 12. And desolations are determined. And here the word desolation also. We're going to come back to that. A whole presentation just with that word and the meaning of it. So there we have an end of the war. And let me be clear, this war ended at the cross, just according to the book of Revelation, chapter 12, because there we can see, and we come back to it later, that the devil was cast out because he was not strong enough against Michael and the angels, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the blood of the Lamb. So, and that can also be seen in what Jesus said in John, the Gospel of John, in chapter 12, verse 31 to 33, where Jesus says, listen to, now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. Oh, that's interesting, because we have the same later on in verse 10 in the book of Daniel 8. Verse 32 in John 12, and I, if I'm lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. This is said, signifying by what death he will die. So again, the death on the cross, that was an end when it comes to the heavenly host, which also Daniel 8 is talking about. And more about that later. So all these 4 words would summarize the book of Daniel, chapter 8, are a significant death, Christ Jesus on the cross. He took the wrath upon himself. It was happening in the biblical feast. And at that time, both the heavenly host was cast out of heaven, and also something concerning the old covenant people. More of that a little bit later. So this is a summary without any pushing or for text, whatever. It's very clear. All 4 words define Jesus dying on the cross. Let's go on and just see how it's written here. We're not going to study it right now. But on the left, as I said, the vision, and the right explanation. But then we have the ram, and it's described that in verse 3 and 4. And verse 20 is very simple. The ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. And we can do the next one, the same thing. Verses 5, 6, and 7 is about a goat. And verse 21 explains easily the shaggy goats is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. That means Alexander the Great. And so we'll do later on and go over these together. But now we're going to go to the second place in Daniel 8, which defines this vision and what it means. And that's verse 13. Then it says, then I heard the Holy One speaking, and another Holy One said to him, we don't know who they are, but the same Holy Ones are speaking in chapter 12 of Daniel also. And there we understand more that it must be two angels. But that's okay. It's heavenly beings. How long is the question? So the duration is of importance. We are not going to study that today, but in another presentation, we'll come back. So how long is important? But listen then what it says. Will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? And that's a very good explanation or interpretation. I should say even translation, because that is what that phrase actually points to. So it's a good translation. And here again, we have 4 defining sentences and or phrases, I should say. And we're going to go over them one by one and see. So somebody wants to say, what vision are you talking about right now in chapter 8? Yeah, it's going to define the vision and the endpoints when it's fulfilled. So the first one, the vision concerning the daily sacrifices. Yes, already in verse 10, without reading it right now, you can see there it talks about, verse 11, daily sacrifice there is taken away. And we also have the same in chapter 12, the daily sacrifice was given over to it. And we know from Daniel 9, verse 27, in the middle of the last week, when Christ is dying on the cross, the sacrifice will be taken away. And I believe that happened 31 AD. So here the visions concerning the daily sacrifice, and 2 times they're taken away. Yes, it happened at the cross. It was fulfilled at the cross. The next thing is the rebellion that caused desolation. Rebellion is not a nice word, but it means more than transgression, which many have. Transgression means to do a sin according to God. And if that is persistent, goes on and goes on and goes on, it turns into rebellion. So this is a strong word. But here is the rebellion that causes desolation. So what is about this desolation? Yes, we're going to study that very carefully also later, but for now, the short one. We can go to Matthew 23 and read in verse 37 and 38 what Jesus said about this. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and stoned those I sent to you. How often have I longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks, under her wings, but you were not willing. You were not willing. Can you see here? This is the fallen Israel, if I may say so. Remember, when we talk about Israel, we talk about the nation, we talk about the leaders, we talk about those in charge. We never talked about the single people in any covenant. It's the same in the new covenant. A church can be corrupt, but the single people can be very faithful to God. And the same thing in Old Testament has always been the same. Corrupt leaders can still be very many who are faithful to God. One example, Elijah on the Mount Carmel with all the 400 Baal's prophets. And he thought he was alone. No, God said to him, there are 7,000 who has never bowed down to Baal. So Even when we think, or let's say in this case, Elijah thought he was alone. No, he's not. There has always been faithful. So I talk about the leaders and those in charge of a nation and nothing about that. And then go to the last verse, 38. I didn't read yet in Matthew 23:38. Look, your house is left to you desolate. And most people believe that refers to the house of Judah. And I do too. But if it includes the house temple in Jerusalem, okay, there's no problem. It's the same thing, but the word desolate. So desolate means that when it comes to people, it's deserted, very few people or no one living there. But when it comes to building, it's more often used destroyed and so on. But there's also places where it's used for the word separation and divorce. And I think that comes closest here to this one. The rebellion that causes a divorce, a separation. So that is now also happened at the cross. We're going to see that later also. The third one is the surrender of the sanctuary. Many versions write here instead the trampling of the sanctuary. And the trampling we see in the fourth line here also. So, and that is the same word. It means to really put down, give a hard time, deny, and do all this stuff to stop and make it hard for Jesus Christ to trample on. But then what about the sanctuary? This is a very interesting thing. So many people are focusing on the building, the temple building, fine. But what if it has a deeper meaning? Sorry, my Swedish came up there. What if it has a deeper meaning? Not the temple building. So let's read. Let's go first to Matthew 12, verse 6. And Jesus is in discussion with many people there and says, just of a sudden, here is one greater than the temple. And the translators in my version put the word one in with a capital O, because they believe this refers to Christ. And I believe too. It's very clear if you read the whole context. Here is one, Jesus Christ, I am greater than the temple. Well, maybe you need some more takes, and I need that too. Needed when I first saw this. John 2, verses 19 to 21. Jesus answered them. Again, it was an argument about what he was doing and who do you think you are, Jesus, so to say. Jesus said to them, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. And of course, we know what he's talking about. They replied, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days. You can hear from the sentence here, they were giving Jesus a really hard time. They tried to trample on him here. But then it says, but the temple he has spoken of was his own body. So again, the same message. Jesus is the temple. And all the other people talked about the building. Think about it for a while. Which one is most important, the building or Jesus Christ? For me, that's very simple. It's Jesus Christ. But this was even predicted in the Old Testament. Let's go to Isaiah 8, verse 13 and 14. And it talks about the Lord with capital letters. So it's the great Almighty God. It says here in verse 14, the Lord will be a sanctuary. Wow. And then two more things, the stone of stumbling and the rock of offense. And the last two things Peter took up in his first letter, chapter 2, verses 6 to 8. And he talks about stone of stumbling and the rock of offense, and refers that to Jesus Christ. But he didn't mention the first one, which also was written there in Isaiah 8:14. The Lord will be a sanctuary. Yes, Jesus is trying to prove for them that he is. And just one more text out of many, Revelation 21, verse 22. There is no temple in the new earth because the Lord and the Almighty are its temple. So Jesus Christ can easily be found to be the temple, the real thing. And when it comes to trampling on, we're going to see that very soon when we also do with the next one. So the trampling on the sanctuary is when Jesus died on the cross. It cannot be more trampling on him than at that moment. So the third defining phrase, what this vision is and ends at, is that Jesus, when he died on the cross. And the fourth one is the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. Yeah, I agree here that this version I have right here, the word Lord's is not there. But, I can change the Bible versions I have, but you can read and check that out too. But the trampling on is coming back several times. I'm going to look at that later too, because in verse 10 and in verse 11, we can see here in verse 10, you have the reached the host of heaven, and the starry host was cast down, and so on. Yeah, we talked about that, Revelation 12, verses 7 to 11, and that ended at the cross. And then the army of the Lord, well, it's still again the same word, host of the Lord, and the daily sacrifice and so on. And the third time here in verse 12. So the trampling on the foot could be the Lord's people very well, or the host of the angels. But the interesting thing, if you look at the word people, and you go over here to this, the end of verse 24, because the rebellion, that's again referring to the Lord's people, and here it says, and the holy people. But here, if you look that word up, Strong says specifically, it can be used for a tribe as those of Israel. And that's what I think is the best here. So even if the angels were cast out when Jesus died on the cross, they were cast out from heaven with the devil. I think here refers to the Old Covenant people. So with that, go back to verse 13 right now. We can see that the four defining statements about this vision and the length of it and when it's fulfilled, it's all fulfilled very easily to find out at the cross when Jesus died. So you can see now, coming so far, we have seen that the summary is Jesus Christ, Daniel's Messiah. We're going to find much more about that as we go on. So summarize again Christ's death when it comes to the summary, verse 19. We have he took his wrath on himself when he died on the cross. It refers to biblical feast, and it points to the Old Covenant people when they separate themselves from God. And when in verse 13, when the daily sacrifice was taken away, at the cross, according to several texts, the Old Covenant people separate themselves from God when it comes to the rebellion that caused the desolation. And the surrender of the sanctuary, trampling of the sanctuary, that's about Jesus again dying on the cross. And back to the people again, trampling underfoot the people of God. And so number 1 and 3 here in verse 13 refers to Christ, and 2 and 4 to the people of God around him. So this is the presentation, which let me see if I can do like that so we can talk again better. So this is a presentation of the first key issues that defines the interpretation of Daniel 8. If this is what you use, fine. If not, pray and think about it. You can check everything out and see what I've done. And I hope you're inspired and want to come back. Next time, we're going to focus more on the time period itself. So see you later.